All right, thanks everyone for joining today. I saw a few familiar names on the participants list, so hello. I'm excited to share with you today a little bit about Factor 8. Factor 8 is kind of a complex and compound factor. So we're going to dive into it as much as we can, but I do want to make sure that I leave some time available for you to ask questions. So please make sure to use that question box. If I've gone over a topic a little bit too quickly, make sure that you use that box so that we can make sure we address your questions. But all right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, just a quick intro. For those of you who are new to CQL or don't know much about us, we are an international accreditation consultation organization, and we always like to start with sharing a little bit about our vision and our mission. And so here at the Council on Quality and Leadership, we believe that our vision is a world of dignity, opportunity, and community for all people. And I just really love the fact that we're not just focusing on one single solitary group of people, but we really work to try to make sure that all people feel included with dignity and opportunities. The next thing is our mission, which is CQL is dedicated to the definition, measurement, and improvement of personal quality of life. One of the things that really drew me to CQL was really all about that personal quality of life, knowing that what I define as quality of life is different than what you define as quality of life. And being able to actually measure that through the personal outcome measures is a great thing. So, all right, those of you guys who have a history with us have heard this quote before, but really change inspires us. We really feel that learning and growing and moving forward is really part of being a great organization and helping the people that you support. And we love this quote from Jeff Pedersen from CHI Friendship: quality is a continuous journey, it's not a destination. So whereas sometimes we think, yay, we made it to this quality spot and then we can relax, unfortunately, that's not usually really the case. Usually we get to that spot and we find additional things that we can work on and just keep moving forward to help the lives of people be enhanced. All right, so as you know, we are an accreditation organization, and our approach to accreditation is really an appreciative inquiry approach. So we look at all the great things that are happening, and we try to enhance those great things and use the techniques and the philosophies that you have in the positive areas just to enhance those opportunities that you have in other areas. So and we don't look at deficiencies. You know, we're all used to those other types of reviews that we get that really talk a lot about deficiencies, but really improvement. And this is just opportunities for organizations to even increase all the great things that you guys are doing. And then again, the continuous quality improvement, which we talked about, is that this is a constant journey that we're on, and we're going to keep pushing and keep supporting you guys to get even better than you already are. All right. So for today's webinar, this is just a quick overview. We're going to talk a little bit about what the basic assurances are. We're going to talk a little bit about what the process is and evidence that we've collected. And then we're going to go over each of the different 5 indicators that we have for this factor. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about how those factors are validated and how we make those decisions. We're going to talk about the data we've collected around having these indicators present in system or practice, and then we're going to take any questions. Little assurances. I love the title of the basic assurances, basically because it really tells you what it is. So these are those basic things that we feel should be in place for people to assure a high quality of life for them. It really talks a lot about health, safety, and human security, making sure that those quality assurance level indicators are present for people in their lives. All right, so there are 10 different factors. We'll talk a little bit about some of the terminology that we use a little bit later, but for the basic assurances is what we use for accreditation. There are 10 different factors, and we are going to be focusing on positive and support today. All right, so there we go. Some of the key concepts here. The basic assurances focuses on essential, fundamental, and non-negotiable requirements for all service and support providers. So again, these are those basic level things that we should assure for all people supported that we have as providers. We have those in place. Organizations are encouraged to implement consensus best practices in relation to each measure. The basic assurances require more than compliance with licensing and certification standards. We use this tool to understand the effectiveness of practice through the perspective of each person. So a lot of times when we go into organizations, people will say, well, our state requires this, and you guys require that. And so we really see that the basic assurance it does require a little bit more work and more compliance with license. All right, so let's talk about that terminology and the structure. So for this factor, you'll see that the terminology of factor that's the big different 10 factors. That's kind of the big overarching topic area. And then underneath each one of those factors, we have what we call indicators. And so those are indicated by a letter. So we're under factor 8, indicator B, and that's kind of the subtopic. And then the probes, those are the questions that we ask in order to validate the presence of that indicator of 8B. So these are kind of the best way for you to really look at your self-assessment and go through and find out if you can answer these questions and if they're in place or not. So when we are evaluating those indicators, we look at two different things. The first thing that we look at are systems. And those are the organizational supports that provide the structure for organizational practices. It may include policies, procedures, staff training, or other types of systems. Organizational practice is what is observed in daily operations. This demonstrates how an organization's systems are actually put into action. All right, so systems are really all about that structure, the policies, procedures, the forms, the training, everything that you have to put in place so that present. The practice is actually doing all that stuff that you've put in place. So the reason why we look at both of those is that sometimes we can have developed a really great, robust system, and the practice just hasn't quite caught up to it. Other times, we're just doing really great things and the practice could be there, but we just haven't developed the system around that practice to support it for continuity. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the process and evidence that we find with Factor 8. So in order for us to kind of look at Factor 8 and find out kind of all the great things that you guys are doing and some opportunities that you have, there's a couple of things that we do. Not the main thing, but we do document review. So we're really looking at those policies and procedures, the forms, how that's implemented, how that is affecting the people that we're reviewing. We do a lot of observations and visits, especially for this one. We're looking to find out, are people's plans what they want? Are they actively working towards those goals? Are we seeing any positive behavior supports that are really helping to look at all factors of the person's life and supporting them to move forward? Are we seeing some possible restrictions or maybe punitive behavior supports that don't necessarily come from a behavior support plan? So those are some of the things that we're really looking at. The other thing is focus groups. We look at that. We talk to people. We do the factor reviews, which are those meetings that we sit down and talk to you about how that factor is implemented in your organization. And then of course we complete those personnel outcome measure interviews to get more information. All right, so specifically document review. These are the we go to look at the evidence of success here. So we look at policies and procedures, committee meeting minutes. So this might include the Human Rights Committee. It might include a behavior support committee that you might have, other committees like that. We look at completed assessments, hopefully a functional behavioral assessment, other rights assessments, things like that would help us to understand. Staff training records. So we're looking at people, staff, and how they're being trained on what positive behavior supports are, how to implement a support plan, whether that be called an ISP or a PCP or whatever state you're in, life plan, whatever state you're in and what they decide to call it. But we look at all those things, making sure people are trained on that. We look at people's records, look at their case notes, progress notes, just to see kind of how their life's going. And then also any additional support plans that might come with that. Then during the observation and visits, we look at a few things that we'll look at for this factor will be how are choice and daily routine offered. Are people really deciding how their day looks, when to wake up, what to do that day, where to work, that kind of stuff? How are person-centered plans implemented? We might talk to somebody and say, tell me a little bit about your plan and how does that look like for you every day? Also, how behavior support plans are implemented. The interactions that we have with other people, including staff and people supported, helps to give us some more information. We might look at behavior tracking charts, schedules, all that kind of stuff that might support people's daily routines and how they're being supported with both ISPs and behavior support plans. And then, of course, we'll look at the goal tracking and behavior tracking to see how that's going. All right, so focus groups may be conducted with people-supported staff, families, and others, depending on the types of services and accreditation that your organization is going on. Focus groups allow us to better understand systems and practices from the perspective of those that are affected by them. Here are some sample questions that we have for Factor 8. So one of them is, who's in charge of your person-centered plan? Can you make changes if you want to? And so, of course, when we're talking to people about this part, we're really looking for them to say, I'm in charge, I'm in charge of my plan. If I decide I don't want to do that goal anymore or work towards that plan, then I can change that when I want to. For staff, we might say, what training have you received to implement person-centered plans and behavior support plans? And do you feel trained enough? Is there any additional training that you might need? And then for family members, we might ask, what input do you have to services and supports your family member receives? So we really want to find out kind of how the organization gets people involved and makes people supported the driving force. All right, so for factor review, each factor is reviewed with the organizational members that have a role in the implementation of systems and practices pertaining to that factor. It's an opportunity for organization to provide examples of what each area looks like in practice. So I really always suggest to organizations that I come to visit that they bring any information that they can to kind of show us what exactly all the great things that they're doing. I kind of describe it as a show and tell meeting. So we're going to sit and talk about different ways that you implement the factor. And I'd love for you to show me all the best practices and ask questions about other ways that we might see other organizations doing this really well. And the last thing is, it's imperative that the right people are present for those reviews who can give pertinent information about how plans are written and implemented. And now this is not just for the main service that you provide. And a lot of organizations will provide, a main service of maybe residential, and they might provide some supported employment in-home supports. And it's important for whoever comes to those meetings that people are able to talk to each one of those service lines also, not just for the main service line that you guys provide. So, and then personal outcome measures. It allows us to better understand quality through the perspective of the person. We'll look at the person's experience. It helps us to understand the effectiveness of systems and practices implemented by that organization. And interviewees are often selected from categories such as people with a restriction, people with extensive health supports, or people who have experienced abuse and neglect. And for positive service and supports, we're really looking and asking to them, what are your personal goals? Have you realized those personal goals? And how are you working towards some of those personal goals? Let's go ahead and jump right into those indicators. Now remember, we're talking about factor 8, and this is indicator A. So indicator A is people's individual plans lead to person-centered and person-directed services and supports. One thing to remember about factor 8 is that it is kind of broken up into 2 different sections. Factor 8, indicator A and B, is really all about person-centered plans. And the rest are all about behavior supports and how we support people to address those behaviors. Indicator A, so the probes under indicator A, there are quite a few. But really what these are trying to get at with us is really, are people realizing and achieving personal goals? And what are those systems and supports that are put in place around the person in order to make sure that those goals are, number one, personal, but they're also being worked towards, okay? So the first probe is really important. Do people realize and achieve personal goals? Those of you guys who are worked with the personal measures know that this is one area in those that we really like to focus on. And I always say it's one of the questions that's pretty straightforward. Can people identify whether or not they've achieved personal goals? And so really the whole point on that PCP, ISP life plan that people are working towards is for them to identify and achieve those goals. And so we're looking to find out how that organization is supporting people to do that. Okay. All right, and then do people have person-centered plans that they develop with individual support teams that are chosen by them? Okay. Again, this is something that we can find out in those focus groups, but also in looking at the plans. You know, we'll look at a person-centered plan and see Jen will learn to count to 5 by the end of the next 6 months. And you know, as we ask more questions about things like that, we really try to find out, is that a goal that Jen really wants to achieve? Or is that something that as service providers, as professionals, we've said, you know, Jen can't count to 5, so she really needs to do that. So we're really looking to find out, are these really personalized goals? The other thing that we really look at is, are the support teams chosen by the person? Can they decide who is part of that team and who is not part of that team? Sometimes that's hard because at a state level, we have all those required people that have to be present. And so sometimes it does take a little bit of creativity to be able to figure out how do you meet those state regulations, but still have people choose exactly who's going to be there to support them. And I think the more people are positive during these planning meetings, the more people are going to want to have them included, and the more of a celebration it'll be for people. And we're not going to go over every single probe because that might take a couple hours. So if you have any questions on some of the probes I don't dive into, please, again, make sure you ask questions in the window. All right, the next thing that we really look at with indicator A is really all about, are we using informed information in order to really guide those plans? So of course, are we using the personal outcome measures? Are we using other assessments and evaluations that the organization uses based on those individual needs to help inform that plan? It's really all about, how are we taking individual information from that person and feeding it right into the plan? All right, the next section about this, it's really an area that a lot of organizations do really well at, is making sure that the action steps are there, that we're documenting how people are working towards their goals, that we're really working hard to make sure that people are choosing their goals and services, including where they work. One area that a lot of organizations have seen success in changing culture is when they focus on probe number 9, where it says, are person-centered plans written in plain language and accessible to the person? Okay, so are we taking these documents that can be very lengthy and very wordy, and making sure that people really understand what those plans are, using different mediums, including pictures, video, anything that we can, just to make sure that people are really involved and are driving those plans. A lot of times what we do is we receive those plans, we put them in the book, and we start working on them, and we completely forget the person. So make sure that the person is involved and knowledgeable about their plans. And then again, are they able to modify their plans? When they say tomorrow, you know what, I thought I wanted to drive a race car, but now I've decided that's not what I want to do. Are we able and supporting them to change those plans when that happens? Okay. And then the last one to talk about on this one is the plan agreed to with informed consent of the person in writing? All right. So one thing I talk a lot about with this area is that informed consent is not necessarily someone signing a sign-in sheet. Okay, it's not saying I was present at the meeting. Informed consent is saying, I know the contents of this plan, I agree with the contents of this plan, and let's move forward and implement it. Just signing that they're there and present is not necessarily informed consent. So making sure, again, that people are really informed of what their plan is and that they agree to the aspects of the plan that are implemented. So indicator B, the supports for each person. The probes for this one, a couple things to point out here is, again, this is really also about the person-centered plans and making sure that people, support staff, people supported, have the training and information needed to properly implement those plans to better, not ensure, but better help that those plans could be successful in their implementation. making sure that the training's there, that the documentation is there. Also, does the organization have a system for ensuring important events that in fact impact the people are effectively communicated between the assigned staff and among other team members? So this is really important, that when something happens that's very significant in that person's life, how do we make sure that all staff are informed of that? Of course, to the person's desires, but that they can consistently support that person through some of those life events too. Okay. Does the organization have a system to monitor implementation of the person-centered plans? So how are we looking at the data around person-centered plans? Are we making sure that the person is engaging in the process of those person-centered plans, is working on those goals and objectives? And how are we using data to make sure that people are progressing along the path of that plan? So again, we can get to that point where they can say, you know what, I'm really proud, this is the goal that I realized this year. Okay. All right, then indicator C, the organization provides positive behavior supports to people. Now again, remember, the first two are all about the person-centered plan, and now we're going to jump into positive behavior supports. This is kind of a lot of the area that we spend a lot of time on. Okay. So under this first part about providing check, the first one, again, if we don't have the policies and procedures to kind of back up and structure our philosophy and our practices, that's really important so that we can ensure that our philosophy can continue and go forward. So the first question is, do the policies and procedures reflect the organization's commitment to positive behavior support or approaches? All right, so what we're looking for in that is really looking to see that the policies and procedures overall that you have really talk about how you're committed to positive behavioral support and looking away from some of those more punitive systems. Okay. We also want you guys to outline in your policy specifically what supports you encourage and what supports that you don't allow within your organization. This policy statement is really, really important for when you're working at, or you're looking at trying to support staff to fully implement those plans that align with your philosophy. And if you have that there in your policy and procedures, then it's easy to go back to and talk to staff about why something that they did may or may not have followed that philosophy. The next area I wanted to point out is, our formal behavior support plans implemented only after the team has ruled out physical and environmental issues contributing to a person's behavior. So what we're looking at with that one is we're looking at in some type of written form to find out what you have ruled out as far as physical and environmental issues. So is the person going through a medical situation that might be causing some of those maladaptive behaviors? And can we just address that health problem before we start putting in some behavior support and possibly restrictions in people's lives? If we could just do that, that's a quick, easy fix, and yay, you know, be much better. Also, environmental issues. How does the environment that the person's living in, working in, commuting to and from work in, how does that affect the person's behavior? And can we modify that? And that would help those behaviors, right? So we really want to make sure that you're looking at those areas before we start putting in some of those more restrictive behavior support plans. And that should be documented in the behavior support plan, ideally, and other places if need be, right? So behavior support plans include teaching alternative communication and coping strategies. When we're looking through behavior support plans, we're looking for quite a few things. One of the things that we're really looking for is, does that positive behavior support plan talk about how we can communicate with that person to best support them? And how can we help them to communicate with us their needs, wants, desires, so that maladaptive behavior that might be through communicating some of those needs might be eliminated. And also to talk a little bit about coping strategies. So, you know, how, when I'm frustrated, can I positively cope with those feelings and working with other people, and how can we really help those maladaptive behaviors lessen, because we're teaching coping strategies those difficult times. And then do only support staff with prior training and demonstrated knowledge demonstrated competency provide the behavioral supports people need. So are people effectively and thoroughly trained on behavior support plans? It's so important that as organizations, we don't just hand over a behavior support plan and say, here, read this and implement it. Some of those behavior support plans are really, really long and wordy, and knowing exactly what to do in each situation can be really hard from just reading it. So being able to learn about it and then demonstrate the competency of what to do in certain situations is really important. So then that brings us on to indicator D. This is the organization treats people with psychoactive medications for mental health needs consistent with national standards of care. Okay, so we're going to kind of dive right into those psychotropic medications. And you know, as you probably remember in Factor 5, we did discuss this a little bit, but we dive into it a little bit more where it comes to treating a psychiatric diagnosis or other things in this area. So the first probe we have here is the use of psychoactive psychotropic medication based on specific psychiatric diagnoses. Okay, so we're looking for a linkage between the psychoactive medication that someone is taking to an actual diagnosis. Now, that might be a diagnosis of, you know, having bipolar disorder, having depression, anxiety, that kind of stuff. Something that is diagnosable. This is not taking a medication because of frustration or because of pacing or because of agitation. We really, really look at only using psychoactive medications to treat a psychiatric diagnosis, because that's really what they're intended for, and not to treat a specific behavior. All right? And again, we really highly encourage with this area that people, when they receive those diagnoses, it's through someone who is competent and knowledgeable to be able to do that evaluation. It's important when you can take someone to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, to be able to do a thorough screening and evaluation of that. All right. And then on from number 4, are people monitored for side effects on a regular systematic basis using a standardized tool or other accepted standards of care? All right, so this is one that I do get a lot of questions about, but it's really about, you know, some of those side effects of those pretty significant psychoactive or psychotropic medications can have some pretty significant and severe long-term side effects. And so we're hoping that you're using some kind of standardized tool, whether it be an Ames test or other tests, that you're using to make sure, help people make sure that those side effects are not pervasive in their life. All right. And then, of course, we really want people to be receiving the fewest and lowest dosage of medication as possible. Some of the things that we look for in this is if we go to an organization and see a list of medication for someone and they're taking, you know, 6 or 7 medications, most of them all for the same diagnoses, then that's something we might have a conversation about. How can we look at the effectiveness of this and talk to the psychiatrist about possibly paring that down? All right. Indicator E. Indicator E, I'm going to talk about quite a few of these probes because this is one that really has a lot of meat and depth to it. All right, so people are free from unnecessary. Will receive only the amount of behavioral and medical support necessary to prevent harm to themselves or others. This really talks about are people receiving the minimum amount of behavioral and medical interventions needed to make sure that they are supported in a way that gives them choice, that gives them dignity of risk, but does support those behavioral and medical needs. We're looking at in this area, are people subjected to additional restrictions in their lives? Are they on behavior support plans that don't necessarily support them to be independent and have dignity of risk? So we're really looking to make sure that those support plans are supporting the person to be able to live their life in the way that they want to live it. All right. Again, during those plans, we're looking to find out what least restrictive intrusive behaviors have been tried. It's important that we don't just jump to restrictive interventions, that we really use that continuum of support to make sure that people are supported in the least restrictive procedures as possible. Okay. And then number 4, does the organization's Human Rights Committee review and approve any highly restrictive, intrusive procedures incorporated to a behavior support plan before implementation? Okay, so it's really important that what we do is that when we're thinking of that someone needs some more highly intrusive and restrictive procedures, that a Human Rights Committee reviews that before we go ahead and implement that. That's really looking to make sure, number 1, we've tried anything least restrictive first, but also looking at any alternative ways that we can support that person before we move into those highly restrictive supports. All right? And then our behavior intervention plans that include highly intrusive procedures or other restrictive techniques implemented only with the proper written, informed consent of the person or the person's legally authorized representative. Again, this is all about making sure that the person whose behavior supported is understands the restrictions, the procedures, the supports that are written inside that behavior support plan, and that they have consented to those. And that they are aware of the support needs and kind of what the intended outcome of that behavior support plan is. All right, the next one I want to talk about here is number 8, do the organization's restraint policies and procedures detail how people are safeguarded? Do they prohibit floor restraints, takedowns, and standing orders for restraints? All right, so just to clarify on this one, what we're really looking about is making sure that you have a restraint policy that talks about how people are kept safe. However, we ask that you prohibit floor restraints and standing orders for restraints. Floor restraints are pretty self-explanatory. Anytime that we are restraining someone on the floor, the risk of injury to the person supported and to staff is significant. And then standing out of her home, that we are to physically restrain her and return her to her home at every time that happens. So that might be an example of standing orders for restraints, where if I do something, that the restraint is always going to happen. Okay. And then number 10, does the organization prohibit the use of timeout rooms? You know, we don't, timeout rooms are something that are just a very traumatic experience for people. And so of course we want to not have that as an option for people. All right, number 12, do behavioral psychopharmacological, I can never say that word, hypotheses result from a functional analysis of behaviors, including a thorough investigation of communicative intent of the behavior? Are these hypotheses developed by the team? All right, so again, we're looking for the organization or the behavior support specialist that is writing those plans, that they are looking at the function of the behavior through some sort of investigation, analysis, observation, record review, that they're really trying to find out why is that person demonstrating some of those behaviors and what is the intent of those behaviors. We believe, as most of us have heard time and time again, that behavior is a form of communication. And so really getting down and trying to figure out what that communication is and helping that to be the starting point for the behavior support plans is really going to help to make sure that those behavior support plans are effectively addressing the intent of the behavior. The second part of that too to remember is that this is not done with the behavior support plan just coming in for a few minutes, observing and going back and writing the analysis. It should really be developed by input from the team, including the direct support professionals who spend a lot of time with people and know them really well. Okay, and then the last little bit, I told you this was a long one. We're going to talk a little bit about 15, which is the organization ensures that people are not subjected to highly intrusive behavior interventions or punishment for the convenience of staff or in lieu of behavior support plan. All right. This is where we see some of those unwritten rules that just tend to creep up, especially in more congregate living situations like group homes or other places where, you know, there might have been a staff at one point who I came across this recently, whose mother told them to always wear shoes or socks in the house because of dirt, and also because it made it so that you wouldn't get the flu. And so in order to help that they weren't cleaning as much on the floors and things like that, people were required to wear socks at all times inside the house. And so some of those things really are pretty intrusive interventions, you know, where I can come in and decide today if I'm going to wear my slippers or my shoes or whatnot. That's one of the examples. Another example might be that, you know, Jen's going to take the person she supports to McDonald's every day if they get ready on time. And if they don't get ready on time, then they won't get a McDonald's. That's just some of those things that are just interventions that are more for the convenience of staff, that are not necessarily written in a behavior support plan. Any of those things where we're keeping stuff from somebody in order to give it to them later, something that you and I can just choose to go and partake of, would be a restrictive plan. So just keep it in mind whenever we are taking away from somebody, that number one needs to be in a behavior support plan and seen as a restriction. But also we need to make sure that it's not just for the convenience of the fact that we support, you know, 6 people in this group home, and it's easiest for us to do it in this way, in this manner. All right. And then the last and very significant question in this indicator is, does the organization prohibit the use of corporal punishment, seclusion, forced exercise, as needed orders for psychotropic medications, and denial of food or liquids that are part of a person's nutritionally adequate diet? All right, so these are all interventions that we prohibit. Corporal punishment is pretty self-explanatory. Seclusion, so having someone stay in an area where they're secluded from other people and can't leave. Noxious or adverse stimuli might be things like hot sauce or loud noises or water, that kind of stuff. Forced exercise, again. As needed orders for psychotropic medications. This is for, you know, using things like Ativan when Jen is agitated. Again, we really look for an organization to have very specific supports around that. You know, if they're going to utilize psychotropic medications and it's in this manner and it's approved in their state, then there has to be some really good checks and balances for making sure that staff are not just deciding, you know, I want to, you know, Jen's getting a little bit agitated, so I'm just going to give her medication rather than try to talk to her. So we really need to have those very specific parameters in there about how a direct support staff might say, you know, this person might need a medication, or the person says I need the medication. And what steps do we go through, whether it be calling a nurse, calling a supervisor, calling a doctor to get that approved. All right. And then again, denial of food or liquids is pretty self-explanatory. All those things must be prohibited and must be written in the policies and procedures that those things are prohibited. All right, so that was just a real quick review of all the basic assurances for this area. There are lots of different webinars listed for positive service and supports, whether it be around person-centered planning and support and behavior supports listed on our website, which is the c-q-l.org, and then look at resources, library, and webinars. Again, don't forget, please your experiences with working through Factor 1 or Factor 8, please make sure that you write those in the question box, and you should have a few minutes to get to those. All right, so when we are validating your self-assessments and making decisions around whether or not those are present in either system or practice or both, each one of those probes is validated, and then we validate the entire indicator for whether or not that indicator is present in system or practice. Okay. So indicators are validated based on a preponderance of evidence related to an indicator, not based on a given number of probes found to be present or not present. So we can't say that, you know, if you've got, you know, 3 out of 5 probes present, then that should be present in the indicator level. It's really all about the totality of everything that we've seen with your organization and looking at the title of that indicator and finding out if we have a preponderance of evidence that says, yes, this organization has a system in place to make sure that this is present and they are actually doing it, so that the practice is then present. all right? During an accreditation, when an indicator is found to be not present in systems and or practice, an action plan is then required. The title of the indicator is not always a complete description of all the elements contained within an indicator. A good example of this is there's one in a different factor where it really talks about how are people involved in leading and directing the services of the organization. And the title doesn't necessarily reflect that. And so sometimes when we take out that indicator for the probe itself and for that very important of keeping people involved, people are really confused because the title itself doesn't always indicate exactly everything that we're looking at with those probes. All right, so red flags. So when we're there for an accreditation, there are a few things that we see that that might an inquiry into a situation. So when we do that, we determine whether the situation is isolated or if there's a systematic pattern. So if we're looking at a couple of different things and we're seeing it present for a few different people in a few different locations, then that might kind of start to show a pattern for people and really need to be addressed. Some red flags may jeopardize accreditation or require additional monitoring to maintain accreditation. Okay, so here are some red flags that we see with positive services and supports. Seclusion, prone restraints, corporal punishment, aversive noxious stimuli, medication used without psychiatrist oversight or without justification, restrictive, intrusive procedures without justification or a support plan. Okay, so these are those things that if these are happening at an organization, they're pretty significant. And so we will work with you on a plan to how to address those and hopefully work with you through accreditation to try and get those remedied. The next one is lack of intervention when people put themselves in a harmful situation. So if we're supporting someone, for example, with a diagnosis of pica, and we just don't have any supports in place for that person on how to redirect them, how to support them through some of those behaviors that might be manifested due to the pica diagnosis, that might be a red flag for us. The use of psychotropic medication for behavior control without informed consent or due process. So if we're using psychotropic medication, specifically on a PRN basis, and just to control behaviors, and the person isn't fully aware and involved in that process, or there hasn't been a review by the HRC, that again is also a red flag for us. And then the use of PRN psychotropic medications administered by non-qualified staff based on subjective reasoning, or by people directing the use of PRN medications who lack professional medical judgment, right? So it should always be someone with professional medical judgment who makes those determinations for people if that needs to happen. All right, so again, if there's any questions about those red flags, be sure to put that in the question and answer box. Moving on, so these are some of those measurable areas with the Factor 8 positive services and supports. So the first one is restrictive behavioral interventions. These are some of those things that you can put data, you can put numbers to, you can look at the implementation of, you can use it in your Factor 10 and other areas just to make sure that this area is stable and doing well and that people are receiving the supports needed. All right, the next one is psychotropic medication usage. Now you can use that if your organization does have a policy around PRN medication usage. How often are people getting those? The average number of medications you support are on. What is the highest number of medications that any person in your organization is on? All those things are really data numbers that you can use. And of course, we're all really used to using person-centered goal attainment. You know, did that person work on that goal today? Did they achieve the goal? Are they getting close to achieving it? All those numbers that most states require us to keep. That's also a data point we can use. Training for staff and people supported around positive behavior supports and what PCP goals are is a good data point. And then incident report data is also a good data point for this one. So then some of the problems that affect this one, there were so many to list. I just chose a few of them because there's quite a few that talk about personal goals and people receiving positive behavior supports. But so people choose personal goals, people are treated fairly, people realize personal goals, people are respected, and there's just so many more that can be linked over to positive services and supports. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the data that we have around these indicators being present. All right, so looking at this one, for factor 8, really the average number of indicators present for people is usually out of the 10 possible, which is 5 indicators, system and practice for each of those, then it equals 10. Usually there's about 9.04 is the average number of indicators present for organizations. All right, so then out of the 5 possible indicators for system present, the average is 4.5, and then for practice present is 4.54. So just pretty slightly higher for the practice present, but really you can see that it seems like the numbers are so close together that they're pretty closely aligned, that if you have a really good and robust system, the likelihood of you having the practice present is pretty good. Okay. All right, so this is a really interesting slide. This one really talks a lot about how the percentage of those indicators being present. So with organizations that we work with, it looks like the highest one is that indicator 8B, which again is all about the person-centered plans and their implementation, that practice is present for a really high percentage of organizations, so 97.6. The area that is the lowest is that last one we talked about, which is kind of the meat and potatoes of the behavior supports and some of those prohibited practices was the lowest in systems. So having each one of those required prohibited practices in your policy was one of the lowest ones that people had present in their organizations. So this is when you have completed your self-assessment. Oh, sorry. And how often does CQL come in and agree with you? So some of the most closely aligned ones is where we have come in and said, you know, this present, yes, we agree with you that this present is, I'm sorry, this practice is present or the system is present. So kind of take a look at that alignment a little bit. All right, so this slide is very interesting. So this one is about the number of factor 8 indicators present, and then the system and practices out of 10 factors, completely total. So it basically is talking about how much of an impact does having factor 8 have on having the rest of the basic assurances present, okay? So it's a pretty high indicator that if you have factor 8 really good and robust, and you're supporting people positively in their behavior support plans and their PCP, that you have a high likelihood of having the rest of those factors present for the organization. Does that make sense? So if you have the indicators for factor 8 present, then it's a really good indicator that your systems and practices throughout the basic assurances are going well. Okay. So looking at this, if you have all 10 of those indicators, again, system and practice for 5 indicators present, then you have usually have about 91.1% of the rest of those basic assurances present. Okay. All right, so these are some of the most impactful probes. So again, meaning that having these present has a higher likelihood that other things would be present for the organization. The number one is, do behavior support plans include teaching alternative communication and coping strategies? We like to show you this information basically because this is the information that has the most impact. If you're going to, kind of focus on some areas that might not be your organization, some good areas to focus on. All right. The next one is AB5, behavior intervention plans that include highly intrusive procedures or other restrictive techniques implemented only with the prior written informed consent of the person or the legally authorized representative. Okay, so all 5 of these are the highest indicators of the impactful probes. So that is the end of the Factor 8 material. Were there any questions that we needed to answer?
Hey, Jen. Deb is asking if we can send out some good examples of good tools to monitor side effects of medications. She's been looking but not finding anything that fits her setting.
Okay, great. Yeah, Deb, why don't I go ahead and send you an email and give you a couple of the options that I've had. If anyone else wants that, is there a good way we can send that out?
We may be able to include it with the slides.
Okay. Great, yeah. I have a couple that I've used. If it doesn't fit your setting, then maybe reach out to me, Deb, and we can find what does.
I think that's everything. You covered a lot of content, and we're just about at time. So thank you all for joining us today. And like I said, we'll be sending out the recording in a week or so. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and everyone have a great holiday. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.